Hey there. This is maybe a slightly odd topic for a video, and I'm not sure how interesting this is, but I thought I'd put it out there anyway. So now you're stuck with it, whether you want to or not. I sometimes get questions from people who say, okay, I've bought this pen, doesn't matter what it is. I don't really like it. What do you recommend? Well, the simplest option is send it back, get your money back. But that's often not what they're looking for. They're looking for some sort of exalted answer. And what I have found recently, I've been experimenting a lot with this in my own pens, is reconsider the nib. Reconsider the nib. I have many pens, and I'm going to tilt the camera down in a moment, and I will show you one or two, maybe three options where I have done something to a pen to make it more interesting to me. Or even just change things up. Sometimes it was already fine. Reconsider the nib. And what I mean by that is, can you replace the nib that is on there with something else? And sometimes that makes a world of difference. Now, we live in a world where there aren't that many nib manufacturers. So if you've bought a Sailor, well, then you need to put on another Sailor nib. There's no other way about it, unless you buy an aftermarket feed and nib collar that allows you to use other nibs, but that's quite involved. You could try putting on another nib. Now, Sailor is a good example because Sailor does not sell parts to consumers and not to pen shops either. So I would love to be able to buy a King pen nib, but you can't. It's not possible. So in those cases, you're stuck. But many companies, especially when you look at smaller pen companies, which is a buzzword that I'm trying to get going, most smaller pen companies use B.R.E, JoWo, Schmidt. There's almost no other flavors because there aren't really any other nib manufacturers in the world that produce stuff on a reasonable scale. So unless they make their own nibs, which is pretty rare for smaller pen companies, JoWo, B.R.E, Schmidt. If you don't know which nib they use, go to the website, because 9 out of 10 times they say, oh, and by the way, we use steel JoWo nibs, or do you want to upgrade to a gold JoWo nib or something like that. There are many websites which allow you to purchase B.R.E and JoWo nibs. Very simple. Just Google it, fountain pen nibs, and you get all kinds of websites closer to you, farther away from you, but they ship worldwide. It doesn't matter. It's just a nib. It's not very expensive to ship because it's not big. It can make a world of difference if you have a different nib on it. Sometimes the nib on it that you get on it is just not very good. Well, then the first option that I would recommend people, and that's what I've been asked them, is, well, would you send it to a nibmeister? Because a nibmeister is a professional who will tune nibs or can even grind a nib into something else. So you don't like your broad nib? How about a cursive italic nib? Have them grind it into that. Now it looks completely different. That can make a big difference, but you have to be willing to do that. If that's not an option, put on a different nib. Just sometimes taking something from fine to broad, or from broad to italic, or something like that, can make a big difference. Likewise, going to a different nib material can make a difference. B.R.E makes great number 8 titanium nibs. If you have a pen with a number 8 B.R.E nib, and if you've bought something from a smaller pen company, number 8 B.R.E nib might be a little difficult depending on the company. But take someone like William Shakur from Titan Pens. His pens, titanium nibs. Number 8, B.R.E, very easy to replace. I use, and I'll show you two examples of that, I use Titan pens, I don't know why I said it that way, Titan pens, with different nibs. Not because there was anything wrong with the titanium nibs that came with them, but just because I had some nibs lying around, I wanted to try out some other stuff, and it's great. Now all of a sudden it's a completely different pen. So I think that's enough talk. Let's tilt the camera down and let's look at some examples of how I have changed a pen entirely by just putting on a different nib. Let's get started. Okay, so I promised to show you 3 pens. Here are 3 pens that I have put different nibs on, and that has really transformed the pen. So let's talk about them. Let's start with the most innocent one. Kyuseido Kakari. A very, very kind viewer sent me this pen. These are not cheap pens, so I'm very, very grateful. And I've been experimenting, putting on different types of nibs. And a nib that I put on this that has really worked well for me is this Navalure nib. This is just a steel nib. There is nothing fancy about it, but it's a very pleasant, I would say, stub nib. I think they're sold as italics. They have curved edges. I would say it's more like a stub, but it's a very pleasant writer, and I'll show you that in just a second. Now, of course, the gold doesn't really match the titanium. Something chrome colored would or rhodium plate or whatever would work a bit better with the trims of the pen, but I still think this is a very nice combination. And again, I will write with it in just a second. I just want to get through the pens. This has completely transformed this pen, and because this pen also has a large ink capacity, it's fun to write with a nib that is really nice and broad like that. Another pen that I use quite a bit and that is a lot of fun to me is this triangular pen that my dear friend William Shakur made for me. He's the owner, operator, CEO, everything of Titan pens. And he 3D prints pens. So here's a 3D printed pen. And then another dear friend made this nib for me. He doesn't really sell them, but this is a nib made of silver on a feed that I'm assuming William Shakur made, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Super broad, super wet nib has transformed this pen, which takes number 8 Bock nibs and came with a titanium nib that was certainly a lot of fun to use, but has transformed this pen into something completely different. It's now ultra broad, it's super smooth, it's completely different, and these pens have a really big ink capacity, so that's really fun to use with such a super broad nib. Again, writing sample in just a second. Now, the final nib that I have, pen I have here, it kind of comes in a two-piece thing. So here is the nib that came with the pen. It's a Sailor cross point, which is basically two nibs welded on top of each other that yields a very broad nib. And yes, this is another Titan Pen's pen, also made by William. But that was not the pen I was trying to talk about. He made that pen for me so I could use that nib. This is the pen in question. This is a classic pen's LB5. In my mind, a fantastic pen. Sorry, I had to lubricate my throat a little bit. Sip of tea. The LB5, beautiful pens, to me. Your mileage may vary. There's only 50 of each finish, and this is the cayenne finish, red finish, flame red. I think it's an absolutely stellar material. It's the fusion bonded acrylic. Look at this. It's insane. It's like it is on fire, and I absolutely love it. That pen came with that cross point nib. Now, when I'll grab a sheet of paper in just a second, I'll write with these pens. The cross point nib has one downside. Fantastic nib as it is. It's very broad. So for everyday writing in Western script, as I do, it's not very suitable. For Asian calligraphy, completely different story. That's why it was designed. But I mean, for me, everyday writing, it's not very practical. So for years, I wanted to use this pen. This is a 0.5 centimeter longer version of a Sailor King pen, but made out of the diffusion bonded acrylic. And I hardly ever used it. And the reason I hardly ever used it was simply that nib on it was so broad. And then your solution would be, well, why don't you buy another nib? Sure. The only problem is Sailor doesn't sell its nib separately. So you cannot purchase a King of Pen nib unit. It's not possible. And yes, maybe occasionally sometimes they show up on eBay, but then they're snapped up straight away because nobody can buy them anywhere else. So at some point I contacted William again, knowing that he 3D prints a lot of stuff, and I said, would you be able to have a solution? And he said, yeah, I can print a nib collar and feed that would hold any number 8 nib. I can do this because I am the man. And I said, well, if you're the man, do it. And so he did. So opening this up, we get a Danny Trio nib. Now, I love the Danny Trio nibs because these nibs, I know it's very reflective in the light, but they are so incredibly pretty. It's a Bock number 8 nib, which would come with an ebonite feed. Right now, it does not have an ebonite feed, but it does have the beautiful nib imprint. And not only that, but this nib was tuned by Mike Masayama, who is one of the greatest nib masters, what do you call it, nib meisters, sorry, alive, in my mind. So it also rides beautifully. William printed this with a clear feed, so it looks red, but that's only because there's red ink in it. It takes on the color of the ink in it, which I also think is pretty nice. Danny Trio, 18K, stub nib, beautiful writer. But this is a nib you can use for everyday writing, and the cross point is much harder. So instead of me continuing to blab on as I'm doing, why don't we take some paper and look at these 3 pens and see how they write and what makes that so nice. Paper. Here we go. This video is brought to you by Pelikan. That's just because I have their paper. Let's start off with that Kyocera Kakari. I'm just opening up the secondary ink chamber so that it has nice flow with that Navalure nib. Expensive pen, by no means a super expensive nib, but a really nicely tuned nib that happens to fit really well on this. So here we have I want to say it's FS, but I'm just gonna leave it with that Navalure nib. The ink here, if you want to know, is Mont Blanc Irish Green. The nice thing about this stub nib is that it adds a lot of character to your writing. It's not really a soft nib, it's not flexy, but it just gives you that slightly calligraphic nature just because of the way it is ground. So all of a sudden, if you take the time to align it properly, which I don't always do, you can have a lot of character to your writing. And that has really elevated this pen. There was nothing wrong with the nib that came with it, but to me, it's made it even more interesting to use. And again, that's the point I'm trying to make in this video. Sometimes changing up a nib can really change the pen. Now let's look at this triangular pen made by William Shakur. Here we have this very interesting silver nib. I forgot the model of this pen, so you're going to have to forgive me. I'm just going to put on Titan pens with silver nib. The ink here is Fountain Pen Revolution Mardi Gras, which has a very nice, it's obviously purple but has a green sheen, so that's well named. This is going to feather because it's clearly an extremely broad nib. It's beyond smooth. You barely feel any resistance on the page over the lazy dog. Beautiful, clearly a bit stub-like in nature. Another pen that I really enjoy using, and this nib, again, there was nothing wrong with the nib that came with the pen. I just find that the nib that is on it now has elevated it a little bit because it has just made it a little bit more interesting than the nib that came with the pen. And that's kind of fun, right? That makes it kind of interesting and fun. Now here we have my trusty, beautiful Classic Pens LB5. With Danny Trio stub in 18K. Oh, the ink is, yeah, okay. The Mont Blanc, I'm just combining this here. Corn Poppy Red. There we are. Beautiful, wonderful nib, very smooth, nice line variation. Mike Masayama did a fantastic job. This nib was very dry when I got it. It's beautiful and delicious and smooth and wet now. So it's great, just what I wanted. So here we have seen 3 examples of how you can radically, I want to do the other way around. You can radically change a pen's performance. And in case you're not entirely sure, here is that cross point nib. You see the point. Like this is not for everyday writing. Like if you're gonna do like carrots or whatever grocery list, you need to have an entire scroll to just put your grocery list on. So very interesting. You can change a pen entirely by the nib. That's the only point I'm trying to make. I've given you 3 examples. Now, granted, these are all somewhat exotic examples, but you can do this on a lot of pens. Buy an Edison pen, it has a number 6 Jowo nib, put on another Jowo nib, see what happens. It can be a lot of fun. And I think people should experiment a lot with that because it can really make a pen go from, okay, I kind of like this to, I actually really love this. And that's kind of fun. So there you have it. Hope this was useful. Let me know if you experiment with nibs and how you do that, what pens you do it with, what nibs you do it with. I would like to read that. Thank you so much for watching. I'm glad to see you later. Bye bye.